What's up everyone, my name is Mark Hawk and today we're doing a side-by-side with the GoPro Hero4 Session up against Sony's HDR-AZ1. Now we're going to put these cameras through a variety of tests. We're covering every aspect that you can probably imagine. You can use any of these quick links to jump to the section you're most interested in. Otherwise, sit back and we're going to start playing them all in just a bit. The Sony Action Cam will be out of its case throughout the duration of this video with the exception of the underwater part. And if you find this video helpful, please consider heading on over to our Help Support Mark Hawk Cam. There'll be more details at the end, or you can press that link in the upper left. We're going to start off by taking a look at the battery life between both of these cameras. Now the GoPro Hero4 Session has a built-in battery, so the battery cannot be removed from the camera, but it does allow us to record for much longer. So we can go up to about 2 hours and 10 minutes in previous tests, but this one we got them in an hour and 58 minutes. The Sony AZ1, since it's such a much smaller size, it has a smaller battery, and we'll only get about an hour and 25 minutes at 1080p 30 frames a second. Now we're going to be taking a look at a lot of different video qualities and resolutions and frame rates, but we're going to start at 1080p 30 frames a second because it's basically equal ground for both cameras. They don't have to push themselves, and in theory we should be getting the best level of quality at their present settings. Now with the GoPro Hero4 Session we have a much wider range in white and black values, which can make it appear like the camera is a little bit washed off, because it is, because we have a much bigger range. But the AZ1 is kind of doing the opposite, where it's crunching the white and black values, so we have a really bright sun and you see we're like losing that edge. And we're also introducing a lot of artifacting to the sky. You can just see a lot of that dancing green in the shot above my head on the right there. That's not because I'm doing any sort of compression. That's just what we're getting raw out of the camera. Imagine you have a full 52 deck of cards and each one of them is a different shade of white. The Hero4 Session has more shades of white. Maybe the AZ1 has more along the lines of 25 shades. So a lot of those colors end up becoming the same. So where we should have a nice, smooth, gradual flow, we end up having that sort of clipping where you're either one side of blue or you're the other side of blue. And that's why we're getting a lot of that artifacting you're seeing in the sky. It's another reason why that bright sun just looks like it's just one shade of color instead of gradually coming off into different shades of white. So the AZ1 has a lot of saturation, a lot of contrast, and it makes for a very appealing image right off the bat, while the Hero4 Session definitely is introducing a little bit of red into its white. Everything feels a little bit muted, and we could, in post bump that up. We're not going to get any sort of clarity back, but we are going to get that same sort of saturation and pop because it is basically a neutral color tone. Now with the Sony AZ1, we're testing out here to see if we get any sort of weird lens distortion as we get to the edge of the screen. We see this in the AS200. I'm not seeing it really here. It's pretty consistent as we get to the edge of the frame on the left. We have a good scene with a bunch of different contrasts, a lot of saturation that we could look at here. And now that we're introducing a bit more color into the Hero4 Session, it definitely doesn't feel as washed out. It feels a little more balanced. If you look at things like the tree, take a look at the tree trunk and look at things like contrast. You notice how on the AZ1 the tree is much darker. With the Hero4 Session it's much brighter. We have a lot more detail when it comes to things like the bark, but the edges on the AZ1 and the bark, it's just more defined. Things like the trees and the shrubs in the background, it's not doing anything wonky like we were seeing in the sky before. There's at least enough detail in there to sort of separate the bushes. That way we don't have patterns just sort of mushing together. Now both frames are a little bit soft, even with things in the foreground. Those leaves that are just sort of blowing around, we're able to see defined edges. We're not seeing any sort of weird artifacting, but it's still a little soft. As we switch off of 1080p and we up the frame rate to something like 120 frames a second, we are going to notice a dip in quality. So as we max up to 100% here, focus on things like the railing right in front of you and look at the detail of the edges of the paint chipping. Now with the Hero4 Session we can do 720p up to 100 frames a second, and with the AZ1 we can actually do 720p at 120 frames per second, but we're going to notice a big dip in quality. Look at the railing behind the main pole. You'll notice a little bit of aliasing on the Hero4 Session on the left side of your screen, while the AZ1 it just gets a little bit softer, but the edges basically stay the same. It's worth noting that when we are filming these higher frame rate modes, we actually are losing a little bit of field of view as the image sensor sort of gets cropped down to sort of compensate for the large amount of frames the camera has to process. So again here, the Hero4 Session is recording at 100 frames a second, while the AZ1 is recording at 120 frames per second. So our slowdown on the AZ1 should be a little smoother since we're able to sort of mathematically break down that 25% slowdown a little bit better. The Hero4 Session is going to have to make up frames, so in theory, so you can go down to 25% with the Hero4 Session, but not without having to interpolate some missing frames. So in theory, you'd probably want to keep it above 25%, maybe somewhere in the 35 to 40% area. Both of these cameras do have different color profile options, but with the Sony, by default, it's set up to vivid. Now, vivid is very saturated and very contrast, and like we saw before, can actually result in some issues. Now, we do have the ability to switch this over to its neutral color mode, which will actually make things a little bit flatter and a little more washed out, similar to the GoPro Hero4 Session. It'll basically add our range back to our whites and our black values. That way we stop having a lot of that clipping. Now you'll see when we're in vivid, take a look at the water right now. We have a lot of the ripple, we have a lot of the nice sharp edges, but we still have a lot of that sort of graininess in the sky. When we switch it over to the neutral color mode though, we notice a lot of that weird artifacting in the sky disappears, and that's because we now have more range. So in theory, if we wanted to do a lot of color correction in post, if we had multiple days and we wanted to sort of color correct it a little bit so everything seems very consistent in our edit, we'd probably want to film it in neutral mode, and that's why this option is here. Now the Hero4 Session actually does have this option as well, but it was lost on me at the time because we were filming in Pro Tune and we actually needed to disable that and put 1080p on again and then switch into flat mode. Completely forgot about that, but it's basically the same concept as the as the AZ1 on the right side of the screen. Now, out of these two cameras, the Hero4 Session is the only one really capable of filming underwater. Now, right out of the box, you can jump in the pool with it with no additional housing and go up to about 15 feet. I've also seen people go much deeper with no issues. It's also got a flat lens on the front, so all of your images are nice and crisp. The Sony AZ1 does come with a waterproof case, but it's more for protection. That's because it has a bubble lens in the front of it that actually adds a lot of distortion when you go underwater, so all of your images turn out to be blurry like you're seeing on the screen here. Now, the AZ1 has been on the market for almost a year and a half, 2 years now, and there hasn't ever been a flat lens introduced. There's never been one that's sort of rumored or a third-party one. So the possibility of being able to really film with the AZ1 underwater without getting images that are like this, that are blurry and unusable, is pretty low. You do have the option to change the scene color though to underwater, which will introduce a little more red and force the camera to sort of balance out the colors. So you have a lot of pretty colors here, but you just don't really have a nice image. Funny thing about this shot though is that mid-November this pool is not heated whatsoever and it's about 55 degrees, like no joke. It was legitimately freezing. My head was pounding as soon as I got out, but hey, we got the shot. While the GoPro accelerated at filming underwater, Sony's action cameras are really good at filming motion, and that's because they all have built-in digital stabilizers. So you can see as we're going down this hill here, compared to the left side of your screen, we have a little more stability on the AZ1. I'm going to say it's reducing around like 50% of our motions, and it's going to save a lot of what otherwise would be ruined shots just from general sort of hand shakiness. It'll help get rid of a lot of those micro vibrations, but it's not going to reduce a lot of those big jarring hits. Now, when you are filming with steady shot on, you're going to have a narrower field of view. You're going to go down to about 135, 125 degree field of view, and that's because it's using the extra frame on the edge that it's sort of not showing you to help sort of warp it around and keep it all stable. Now you can see as we're jogging here, we're not completely getting rid of it, but it's a lot more stable than the Hero4 Session. And in a second here, we're actually going to do some handshakes, and you're just going to be able to clearly see the difference. Now also keep in mind when you are filming in steady shot, you are taking a little less in quality, but you also are eliminating a lot of the really bad lens distortion that the AZ1 has that we'll kind of get to in a little bit here. And this shot's really good for looking at depth of field. If we want to look at things like the railing that's like right in front of us, it's really close. It's maybe within 2 feet of us, and then we have the railing that's kind of across. That's about like 7 or 8 feet away from us. And both of these cameras, they're pretty much in focus with anything that's about 5 feet out. I'd say the GoPro Hero4 Session is somewhere around like 4.5, 5 feet, while the Sony is about 5 feet, 5.5 feet out for having everything sort of in focus. So really good if you have a selfie stick. If you're just holding it out with your hands and facing it, you probably want to get a little more distance. But both of these cameras, again, sort of on par with one another. Again, looking at sort of our white values and our black values here, you can see on the AZ1 just how that sun is just sort of blasting out. But the Hero4 Session is doing something similar. The Hero line of cameras has always been really good and tuned for low light settings to look really good during that sort of golden hour period. Then take a look at things like the detail on the CNN building on the right side of your screen. Notice how we can just see all the window panels on the AZ1 really well. On the Hero4 Session, they're just a little bit soft. It's definitely, we can still see some of that detail. Things like the sky though, like we have that little plane chemtrail sort of thing in the upper left. We see that a little better on the Hero4 Session. Now while we are moving here, we actually don't have steady shot turned on, and that's because I want to take a look at the lens distortion on the AZ1. Now if you think of the AZ1 having a sort of an oval in the center of your screen, The closer you get to the edges of those ovals, the more extreme your lens distortion is going to get, and it's going to sort of multiply the closer you get to the edge of your screen. So look at things on like the horizon line here when we sort of tilt down. Notice how on the AZ1 it does sort of a U-like shape, while the Hero4 Session, we definitely have lens distortion there. It's just nowhere near as extreme, especially towards the edge. Now with the Hero4 Session, you're going to notice a lot of lens distortion on basically the lower part of your screen and the upper part of your screen. But if you were to draw a middle horizontal bar across the center, there's not a whole lot of lens distortion in that area. With the AZ1, again, it's more of an oval in the center of your screen, and once you get outside of that oval, we start to have a lot of lens distortion. Now, the only real fix we can do with this with the AZ1 is to enable steady shot for all of our shots. That way we have a smaller field of view, and we basically cut off a lot of those more extreme portions. But if you're doing a lot of locked off shots, doing steady shot in a locked off shot has a tendency to sort of make the frame drift a little bit as it sort of tries to detect motion. It might drift a little bit to the left, so that's something you're going to want to look out for. Now the Hero4 is actually going to give us a lot of options when it comes to sort of field of view and resolution options. Now we can start filming in 1440p with the Hero4 Session. That's going to give us more field of view on the top and bottom. This is really good if you're doing something on a trail and you want to capture everything from the trail to the sky. You don't want to worry about tilting it too far up or too far down, because we could always crop it down to 16:9 later. But if we're in a really tight, confined space, or we just want to make sure we get everything with no work later on, we can enable Super View, which gives us that 1440p and squishes it down, and also gives us a little more room on the left and right side of the screen, but gives us a lot of lens distortion. Now we do have a wide field of view, and so does the Sony AZ1, and then as well we can do a medium field of view, which is what you see right here now on both of these. Medium field of view is going to help, probably your best bet at removing a lot of that lens distortion that you see on either sides of these screens. And it should be noted that the GoPro this time around actually does not have a narrow field of view on the Hero4 Session. You can really see the differences as we cycle through them, especially with Super View and how it has a little bit of distortion on the left and right. So in this section we're going to be testing out the sound quality between these cameras. Now the Hero4 Session is going to be at a disadvantage slightly because it is in a waterproof housing, but it uses a new dual microphone system that will automatically switch to the back microphone if there's a lot of front noise. So if there's a lot of wind noise, if you have it mounted on the outside of a vehicle, it'll automatically switch. Now the Sonys are using stereo microphones, which are really good and have a wide range when they're directed at a target. But for things like ambient noise around them, they're not as strong, but they're still able to capture that sound. Now, normally we test things out with music, but this time around, we're going to do something a little bit different. Sony action cameras have always done a really good job and a really good consistent job of filming in low light. Now, while it's true both of these cameras do use Sony image sensors, in fact a lot of companies use Sony image sensors, but it's all about sort of the hardware that goes into them, the software that goes into them, and you can get a lot of different results. Now Sony's line of action cameras is using a backlit image sensor, and that's allowing us to get away with having this really nice balanced image. All the whites look really great. We have a really nice sort of dark blue sky that doesn't feel really red and purpley, sort of like it does on the Hero4 Session. We just have a lot more detail that we can see out in the distance. Again, everything is kind of soft on both of these cameras, so I don't really know if I would recommend both of these as a dash cam. The nice thing that is, the really nice thing about both of these cameras is they're both really small. So they're really good for mounting when you're sort of like on a motorcycle, or if you had to keep it mounted on the side of your head, or if you're putting it on an object. They're both very tiny and light cameras, especially the Sony AZ1. The size of that camera is just ridiculously small. I do find the Hero4 Session is a little harder to mount just because it is a cube. I mean, it's similar to like the Hero4 body, but it's not as thin. I really like that thinness. Now with the AZ1, it really has to be mounted to the side of the object, and with that extreme lens distortion, it can be a little hard to get a good perspective, because if you mount it on the side of your helmet, you might be getting a lot of your helmet, but since it's so light, you can kind of project it off your head a little bit, and you should be fine. But again, with like things like low light here, we're just seeing a lot more detail with the AZ1. We can make out the railings really well. We can make out that building in the back really well. But we're missing out on like a lot of the finer detail. It's going to be really hard to read signs, and that's kind of why I'm a little worried about recommending either of these cameras as a dash cam, because things are so soft. I feel like you'd have a really hard time of reading a license plate, and if the person bailed and you needed that information, I don't know if these cameras would be the best choice for you, but at least in their price range, you know, these are the kind of results you're gonna get, and we are gonna get a nice bright image out of the AZ1. So as long as we need a sort of, if we're filming a lot at night, like let's say we're doing night snowboarding, AZ1's gonna look really good, especially as long as you have some light in the environment. Both of these cameras can give you a decent result, like we just saw in the last shot there. On the stairway and the walkway, the Hero4 Session looked great, but as we were losing light in the distance, the Hero4 Session, again, just gets really muddy. The Sony AZ1 just does a really good job of boosting up the environment and making it look much brighter, and it's a much more appealing image. The Hero4 is using an 8 megapixel image sensor at a resolution of 3264 by 2448. That's a 4:3 aspect ratio. The Sony AZ1 is going to be shooting a 4608 by 2592 with an 11.9 megapixel image sensor that's actually larger than the AS200. And both of these cameras do a really fantastic job with images, and I actually love taking photos with the AZ1. I really like the button being placed on top. With the AS200, it's sort of more expensive upper model. The button's in the back, and as soon as you press that button, it takes the photo. There's no sort of delay. With the Hero4 Session, there's a slight delay after you take the photo. That way the camera can come to a complete rest. We don't have to worry about motion blur or us pressing forward and kind of ruining an otherwise great shot. We don't show it off here though. When it comes to time-lapse photos, the Sony line of action cameras actually gives you sort of a very small bitrate photo that's really hard to work with, while the Hero4 line of cameras is using a full-res image for your time-lapse. And if you want to see these images in full raw goodness, you can actually download them in the more information section below this video. If you're finding this video outside of YouTube, head on over to markovcam.com or find markovcam on YouTube and you'll find the download link there. Anyway, that's going to wrap up our side-by-side of the Hero4 Session up against the Sony AZ1. Sorry if this sounded a little rushed. It's really late. We're in the holiday season. We're trying to get a ton of videos done. If you found this video useful still, though, please press like and share. It helps me out tremendously. And if you're feeling super generous, head on over to my Patreon page and consider making a little donation. Patreon's a way that you can support YouTubers such as myself, so we can just dump this money back into YouTube, and it just makes the whole process a little easier for me, and it's a huge morale boost. But again, if you can't donate, like and share is a huge help to me. I'm Markovcam. Let me know what you thought in the comment section below, and I'll see you out there. Have a good one, everyone.